Morning, good afternoon to those who have joined us from other parts of the world. So welcome to Cooper Gallery's virtual space. My name is Sophia Yadong Hao, and I'm director and the principal curator at Cooper Gallery, a public art gallery associated with Duncan Jordanstone College of Art and Design in Dundee, Scotland. So this evening's event is part of Suzanne Lacy's solo exhibition at Cooper Gallery, Between the Door and the Street. And I'm thrilled to have Suzanne here today with us at this In Conversation event, where we will share reflections on the exhibition and expand more on the ethos, strategies, and the poetics of Suzanne's practice. So this event will be supported by my colleagues Peter Amo and Runa Jack, who will be working alongside me to ensure the smooth running of this evening. So for those who haven't visited Suzanne's exhibition or won't be able to visit, I thought it might be a good idea to give you a quick visual tour of the exhibition as I introduce Suzanne. Celebrated internationally as a pioneer in social practice, also known as a socially engaged practice and a public performance art, I would also argue Suzanne's practice can be considered through the lens of conceptual art, specifically the dematerialization of art theorized by art critic, curator, and activist Lucy Lippard, which is also underscored by the feminist activist movement in the 1970s. So Suzanne's singular practice encompasses installations, videos, public performances, and writing as the means to instigate discussions on and bring attention to urgent social concerns, including aging, class, gender equity, identity, immigration, labor rights, urban and rural poverty, racism, and violence against women. Well, it's been steeped in ground-up practices of community organizing, coalition politics, and political activism. Suzanne's work is also infused with the poetic and aesthetic sensibilities of the avant-garde. So Suzanne's work often draws on feminist strategies and tactics, including consciousness raising, expanding audience, inclusion strategies, and naming the political in the personal. So a professor at Roski School of Art and Design, University of Southern California, Suzanne is also known for her writing, her seminal publications amongst many others, including Mapping the Terrain, New Rural Public Art, and Living Art, writings on performance, politics, and the publics, 1974 to 2007. Suzanne has created large-scale public performances and social practice projects around the world since the 70s and inspired and influenced generations of artists, curators, activists, researchers, and writers. I'm certainly one of them. So Suzanne's exhibition at the Cooper Gallery joins a number of major stagings of her critically important and pertinent works across Europe and beyond at the moment, including the 16th Sharjah Biennale and the Maps Museum in Coen, Denmark. And the two new exhibitions will open imminently in Museum Tangley in Basel and MBK in Berlin. So the exhibition at Cooper Gallery, Between the Door and the Street, is centered on a social practice project Suzanne realized in 2013 in a Brooklyn neighborhood in New York, where Suzanne worked closely with over 400 women and some men from activist groups over 6 months, engaged in conversations about what is feminism today and the critical issues confronting women. So the project culminated in a one-day public performance taking place on 60 stoops and witnessed by over 2,500 people. I'm sure Suzanne will unpack further about the project in our conversation. So now a quick outline of the proceedings of this evening. So before we start our in conversation, and we will show a couple of clips from the film installation. And the In Conversation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, and we will then open the discussion to the audience. So during the In Conversation, please feel free to put your responses and the questions in the chat box. And my colleague Peter will collate them for discussion later. So now we will show the film clips. Thanks.
And I was talking to him, you know, specifically like about catcalling and like how degrading and upsetting like that experience can be for a woman. And he said, but don't you think that there are some women who want to be catcalled? Like, don't you think there are some women who say, oh God, I wish today some guy would just say something to me, like I want to be noticed by a guy. But I think that people don't see that you have to respect women's boundaries.
That's why street harassment is such a huge deal for me, because I'm like, just treat me as a person walking down the street and not a piece of me. I'm like, talk to me like I'm your daughter or your sister or your mother. Don't talk to me like I'm your next meal, because that doesn't appeal to me, and that won't get me to stop. That'll get me to continue to be afraid to be in my body because you find it attractive, and that could be potentially dangerous for me.
Sure. It made me a lot more conscious of what I wore. Like, maybe another guy will start masturbating in public to me, like if I wear shorts this short. Like, it just made me feel so much more self-conscious and like withdrawn, kind of. And it did have a really big impact on my life, and I just think it's so unfair that he was just able to get off of the subway like that and leave me so like changed.
When you're a white woman who's well-to-do, who expects like courtesy and respect, and you walk on the street and a black man is hollering at you, he becomes a perv and a creep in a way that the sexist manager who manages you and like says something about the way your legs look. He's not a creep, he's just...
But then what happened in prison? Because before I went to prison, I wanted to change. I honestly wanted to change, but I was homeless, I was on the street, I didn't have Medicaid. So you can't just walk into a drug program if you don't have Medicaid card.
Here's a chance to change a child's life that has been rocked some kind of way. Anytime you're put into the system, you're rocked. There's no way around that. How do you bring a child back that's been damaged? By loving them, by showing them that there is care in your heart.
So not too long ago, I was walking down the street with one of my gorgeous goddaughters. So all my life, I've been accustomed to hearing men say, hi, gorgeous, and I say, hi. I just know they're talking to me. Yes. He said, hi, gorgeous. My goddaughter said, hi. I'm like, what? I'm middle-aged now. Oh, I get that.
I consider myself a feminist because I am against any sort of injustice. Not just injustice towards women, injustice towards undocumented women, injustice towards women of color, injustice towards LGBTQ identified people, injustice towards poor people. Like injustice, feminism is not just equality for women.
So, Suzanne, welcome. Now it's a formal welcome to you. Okay, I think maybe we could just start with these particular projects right now on show at the Cooper Gallery. So what's the social and political conditions that triggered you to make this work in New York back in 2013? If you could talk a little bit about that.
I'd been working in London with developing a project with Tate Modern called Silver Action. And around that time, I was looking at how people today thought about feminism, because that changes dramatically over time. And I was particularly interested in how young activists thought about the word feminist, what they thought about. And for me, activism and around discrimination and equity issues is pretty aligned with, or in fact contiguous with, even the same as feminism. So if I'm working with women in Ecuador, if I'm working with young teenagers in Oakland, to me, those are feminist practices. Because they deal with issues of equity, discrimination. I was invited by Ann Pasternak at that time working at the Creative Time organization, and Ann invited me to come and think about, I was thinking about how feminism in England played out for the past 50 years. And she prompted me to come to New York to think about to think about feminism in New York. So for me, given that my practice is question led, I would say that I have questions in this project. My question began with, what do younger people or what do activists think about the word feminist? How do women understand the concept of feminism and today? And so we began by creating a kind of a list of all the organizations in New York that had anything to do with women and feminism in some kind of more or less activist way. And that included everybody from caretakers to housekeepers to women in prison and so on. And that sort of began the inquiry for the project.
That's brilliant. But then, did you work with them for quite a period of time to work out all these questions and inquiries?
Yeah. So I worked over a year, and the process was fairly elaborate. I would go back and forth to New York since I live in Los Angeles, but I spent a lot of time there. And it started literally with going to these organizations and asking this question about whether or not, whether or not there were women's organizations. How did they now think about the issue of feminism? And I got some interesting answers, particularly about 70s era, which I am a 70s era feminist. There's quite a bit of prejudice, I would say, and probably some accuracy and also some real misunderstandings about feminism, which has for some people, tainted the word feminist. So they might say, I'm an activist on immigration, women in immigration, but they wouldn't say I'm a feminist activist on women in integration, which I would. So it wasn't so much that I thought they should, it was just that I was curious about how people framed activism, because in the arts, a lot of ideas about feminism up until recently became disassociated from activism. It was sort of theoretical feminism, identity-based feminism, but not activism as a feminist practice. I was very interested in, of course, for me, re-engaging those, but curious about how these different organizations understood this. So we picked 100 organizations, finally, and we recruited a group because the organization at that time did not have a highly diverse staff. They had some diversity, but we basically brought on board 10 young women who were feminists, no, who were activists, but women of color. And we gave them a training session in how to organize. And through that training session, they each took 10 of the 100 organizations, and they approached the organizations and talked to them about the project and solicited engagement. And more than engagement, it was soliciting their take on things, on what was important for women now. And so all of that information gets fed into a giant hopper of these 10 young women, plus a staff that was producing the project, plus an advisory group we put together of, I think it was something like 19 women and one man. And that, again, was quite representative of diversity in New York. So all of these things were sort of strategically created in order to develop a communication between the project and people in the community. That's one piece.
Is that a kind of almost like a general tactic or process in any work you do? You start with questions and then set up advisory groups. Because to me, that's a feminist activist tactics.
Yeah.
You know, in the 80s, they called the action group. That's how they would do.
Yeah. I'm very much steeped in community organizing too. I've studied community organizing strategies outside of feminism that were very emergent in the 60s and 70s. And so basically what I understand, and I think finally the art world is coming to understand, is that you cannot have a diverse project without diverse leadership. And so in some cases that means like you step aside. And in the case of, and you step aside in a variety of ways, in terms of authorship, in terms of posing your ideas, your imagery, you step aside even in terms of leadership or even doing a project. Like I've said to many people, I wouldn't do the Oakland projects, a 10 years series of works with teenagers in Oakland, California, between, I think it was throughout the 90s. I wouldn't do that today. I wouldn't do that project in that place because of the emergence of a much more prominent Black leadership in the art world. And so that's stepping aside by saying, I'm not the person that does this work at this point in time. But in this case, in the case of New York, we were still at a moment in 2013 and in New York where asking the question, what is feminism and what's its relationship to activism today? I still could serve as an articulator of process, but the content came directly from the people I was working with. And we had a fairly elaborate system of communication. The 10 young women who were trained by the project one of the two project managers, was the 10 young women and me, and, you know, in terms of community organizing, would go out, contact the organizations, find a person within each organization who stood as a connector and a collator of the vision and a supporter of the people in that particular organization. So we would find that person and then we would set up a conversation with them. And the conversation was, what do you think is important? What do you care about? What are the important questions you're framing? And then those questions came back and went through the advisory group, which was highly diverse. And the advisory group sorted through questions, added questions, and then passed them on to the staff, me included. And we would look at those questions and sort of see where they came together and see what a kind of a narrative might be. And then they went back to the groups again who rediscussed them and decided how they wanted to address the questions in the middle of the performance. So that's
really interesting.
There's also the strategy we had to develop just to produce the actual live event.
Yeah. So actually, you touched upon this already about authorship. So we all know authorship is such a kind of constantly circulated question in the theorization and the discourse of social practice or socially engaged practice. I prefer social practice. So what do you say the limits of your authorship in your practice? So do you just focus on that?
Well, first off, over time, I've developed certain strategies, and they're my strategies. I don't say everybody should have them. I have strategies about finances. I have strategies about authorship, about naming. I have strategies about the creative activity itself, the creative image, how the image operates. One thing that is absolutely clear for me is I do not determine content. what I do is think through, and I don't even determine image in terms of its inception. So in the lead up to a work, there's a lot of people who come forward as advisors and as participants, and sometimes they're paid and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're advisors and sometimes they're staff. Sometimes they're just artists hanging around with me in the project. So there's a lot of people involved in these projects, hundreds sometimes. And I don't set the like I said, I don't set the content. I set the stage for content to be revealed based on lots and lots of input. So basically, I'm kind of framing a conversation in the same way that you're framing a conversation with me. But interestingly, the question of authorship never comes up when a theorist curator addresses an artist, or an artist addresses a student. Maybe they would bring it up. But authorship is of content, I think, has to remain with those people who hold those experiences. So that's very clear line for me. In the crediting of the work, who gets credit for it? Sometimes it's out of my control, and that has to do with how I've discovered that from the 70s, how in particular mass media operates, and how the art world wants to have me do a lecture and not one of the staff people that I worked with. So there's ways in which it's out of my control, but to me, authorship is earned in a sense, and the earning of it takes place through the production. And the production takes place over a lot of time. So I see the spheres, the circles of engagement with people coming toward the center and people moving out of the center based on their own capacities, time, available resources for the project, and so on. So that's a strategy I've developed about authorship. I think that, and when I did my retrospective, We Are Here, if you go through the catalog and you go through the labels and stuff, you'll see a lot of people listed. And even that isn't the complete hierarchy, but that's really suggests who put the time in and who created the kind of work process that leads to a work of that scale as Between the Door and the Street. So those are two or three things I've developed, practices I've developed over time. In terms of economy of a project, I tend to pay, I have a fee. The fee doesn't remotely pay for my living expenses or income. I earn a living as a teacher. So the income from the performance, because of the scale of the work and the lack of resources available for the work, even an expensive project pays tech people, it pays key producer people, whenever possible, it pays support money for participants, but it doesn't pay participants in a project that is, got 300 or 400 people in it. And those people have to decide to come based on their own intrinsic interest and how they do or don't buy into the project. And, I've had people say, you know what, great idea, but I don't want to do this unless you let me dance. And I'll think about it and talk to other people on the staff and everything. And then I'll say, it's not a performance about dancing. And they'll say, okay, well, we won't be in it. And I'll say, okay, fine. So all of the people that you see in my performances, except maybe occasionally police officers, all of the people are completely voluntary. They want to be there. They feel their voice is represented. They want to represent their voice. In the case of police officers, I've sometimes had bosses say, you're going to go there.
But that's, I really appreciate your honesty, in terms of the process of all this. I think, there has been a big discussion around paying artists in Britain, in the UK. And I think a lot of organizations, I think Scotland is actually really far ahead than anywhere else. And how organizations work in terms of the ethics of organizations. But then, as an artist, from your viewpoint, how you would map out the ethics within this, how you work with people. And I guess it's not only about the practicalities of the production, but also in terms of the production of meaning, what the project means for people. And then if people would want to take a part for all sorts of agendas they're operating within, both socially and politically. Um, that's quite interesting. But then when you work with organizations, I don't know if organization, in terms of the operations in the States is quite, I guess it's quite different from in the UK. But I feel, in recent years, and more organizations realize, institutions realize in their practices, they perhaps need to really embrace this idea of labor, the invisible labor in all this. And I believe that has been discussed throughout several waves of a feminist movement too. And how would you actually put that ethos of feminism into the
I know what
praxis?
you're saying, and I have to say I'm probably a dinosaur in terms of my context and the time that I came of age, um, because the issue of volunteerism and people joining with each other and doing almost a political action is highly collaborative, and I come from that perspective. When you but when you introduce money for artists, a lot of artists get mad at me because my very small fee, I mean, literally does not even pay, in some cases, $1 an hour. So my very small fee is worth it to me to put it in a budget as a slush fund. So what my 5,000 or 10,000 for a year or two project, and that's really what we're talking about, gives me is enough money to say, you know what? I want those women to wear yellow scarves. I insist they wear yellow scarves. And when it comes back to me, and I'm dealing with a project right now that's exactly this issue. When it comes back to me, sorry, there's no budget. I say, well, yeah, there is. There's my fee. And I use it. And I've made that separation so that I can earn a living as a faculty member, and I can do whatever I want and as much as I want in my work. I can fulfill the kind of passion and aesthetic drive. So I would say that I make essentially no money on my work, and I've had artists, particularly at certain periods of time over the years when these issues were coming forward more, like in Chicago in the United States about 15 years ago, they would say to me, you shouldn't do these projects. And I would say, but I would be a teacher then. I wouldn't be an artist. Because when I began, I raised my own money. Museums didn't do it. I would raise $50,000, $100,000 to do a project. So I come from the tradition of self production. And I'm not saying other people should do that. And I think it's a noble fight.
Fair enough.
It's
Yeah.
just not my fight. My
Yeah,
fight is
and
if you want to take a project and give me a living wage, you'd be taking 50% of every project, and I couldn't do a project. And I would have to make my choices based on how do I make a living? And I don't have to do that now. I can do a passion project, which they almost all are. So I think it's a very important issue. And the issue of volunteers, emotional labor, everybody's talking about all that. Boy, I hope in 10 or 20 years we get to the point where women's emotional labor is even recognized, let alone being paid for. But I do have a form of equity with volunteers. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but people I work with, I feel I owe something. So on the simplest level, if I work with a student and the student emails me and says, will you do a letter of reference for me? And that takes me 30 minutes or an hour. Or if I think about the student and I call up and say, hey, you need to get money for this student to go to school, or all of the kinds of things that in my work are extensive, the relationalities that continue over time and over decades, literally. That's an exchange that I do my best to honor. But of course, if 100 people show up for a performance, to be in the performance, I'm probably not going to be able to support 100 of them, with that kind of exchange. But I believe in it as a principle, and I guess I do the best I can at the moment.
Yeah, fair enough. But also, I guess, the exchange cannot just be measured by money. There are all sorts of exchanges. The artists exchange works, that has been done throughout the times. Um, and I remember somewhere, I think actually my colleague Peter Amer told me about an artist instigated this exchange, if I copy edit for you and then you do something for me. So it's not the money, measured, the value is not measured by money, but by exchange of labor. I can definitely see the point for that. But I actually, wanted to bring things you talked about, the volunteers and how people gather. And I want to just a comment, because I've been thinking about your practice in relation to my own curatorial practice. And my own practice as a curator is very much inspired by this one single book, which is Hannah Arendt's 1958 book called The Human Condition. So in that book, Hannah Arendt wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, she talks about the public realm is a common world which gathers us together. Then she acknowledges that this common world had lost its power to bring people together, because she's talking about this whole idea, what exactly the political means. And then she talks about this idea of the space of appearance. So to me, your work really illustrates this idea of the power of the space of appearance. That's where the political lies. And for me, the performance sitting on the stoop occupy a uniquely liminal zone between the intimacies of the home and the contemporary anonymity of being in public. It's really sitting on the threshold of, the private and the public. So I wondered if you could talk about the appeal and the potency of this voice, this voice. Of course, in the film, in the practice, in the project itself, the physical voice, but also this idea of voice as a political power. So could you just talk a little bit about this idea of a voice that is
I would
neither
say
properly private, but not really public?
I would say that's exactly correct in terms of how I work, and the potency of my work, I think, has to do with bringing out an authentic voice, or to the degree possible in a public setting, bringing out an authentic voice. And that public setting is problematic for the personal. I was very influenced by the development of the phase of the feminist movement, the second wave, and it was the second wave, right? Not the second wave. And in that we use consciousness raising to kind of rethink who we were in the world and what our issues were and what was personal and what was political. Was I raped because I was wearing a short skirt, or was I raped because 4 other women in the same group were raped? And that's interesting. It doesn't really sound like it's just all of us could have done the same thing. I was asleep. Another woman would say I was asleep in my bed. So we began to look at how personal experience for oppressed peoples, in this case women, was very much a political experience. And if you look at Black Lives Matter, the Chicano movement in the United States, you know, they do come from voicing how we see the world, voicing our experiences. And women were particularly good at the personal. And so when we began through consciousness raising, not just to express the personal, but analyze the personal, and that's the part of consciousness raising people miss often, is that its point was a political analysis. Its point wasn't expression. It was to take the hidden, bring it into the public, and say to people, I don't think this is coincidental that it happened to me. I think something's going on here. What is going on in society that women are systematically violated and raped in almost every culture of the world? And so I think that my projects are about helping to cultivate the personal, supporting the voices, supporting the ideas, the questions, creating the narrative, the prompts, as it were, for people to talk in public. Obviously, with the number of people that talk in public in my performances, I can't control them. Nobody can control them. So they can say whatever they want. So to the degree they buy into the value of the work, to that degree they express themselves, to the degree that is safe for them to do so. And that takes us into two different directions. One, critical pedagogy. And I just want to point out, because we can return to that, my colleague Chris Robbins did an interview with me in a critical pedagogy book that talks about how he sees my works as public space, commandeering public space in order to lift the voices of others and create a truly democratic society. But it also takes us into the direction of another part of my process, which is the production of performance. And my performances are really elaborate. They look simple. They, you know, people think, well, if I've got $20,000, can I put 500 people on a roof and have it work like the Oakland projects? And it doesn't, for a variety of reasons, but mainly because there's an apparatus that does two things. It supports the development of a coherent narrative, and then it protects the performers, so that the performers are elaborately protected within any performance. In the case of Between the Door and the Street, let me just say that there was 3 communication system. There was a woman on this side of me with walkie-talkie, woman on this side with a different kind of system, and me on another with another. And I was directing 10 site. We had 360 women in the performance on around 60 stoops. So we had the whole street blocked off. Around the corner, out of sight, we had an ambulance. We had a set of doctors. We had people to protect every single stoop. We had a woman standing in front of the stoop with a walkie-talkie attached to one of my 10 stage directors who was attached to me. So I knew when somebody was trying to get into the middle of a performance. And I also knew, because we had a leader in each group that was selected by the group, I knew if a woman who had experienced violence had gotten into a place that wasn't safe for her, because the woman in the group would tell one of the directors, the woman who was guarding the stoop would tell us what was happening at that individual stoop. So we had a massive group of people that were all connected, and there was safety plans for everything. And that plus keeping it on time and making it appear seamless, keeping it so that the 2,000 people or so that come in there have a good experience. And so the women participating feel proud, they feel engaged, they're happy with what they did. You can't do that with everybody, obviously, but if you have a person in a small group who convened the 5 women, she can check in on them later. She can see what the fallout, if any, is. She can, so there was an elaborate care mechanism and elaborate performance structure going on. So that's
really fascinating to hear, you know, all these backstage safe nets around the projects, and also all this care you put in, and the huge production team behind this one-day community performance, public performance. It's quite interesting. You know, you talk about it as a performance, but then to me, you know, these performances are completely different from the, you know, theatrical performance, but it's almost as a performance of the process of empowerment. You know, not only through the content all these people are talking about, but through the production process as well. It's really interesting, you know, we talk a lot about your practice in general, and a lot of practical elements how to put this show on at Cooper Gallery. But this is the first time even for me to hear all these details.
Yeah.
So really fascinating, brilliant. And also I was thinking about this space of appearance, you know. I'm just going back to what I wanted to talk about. To me, your work, you know, these supporting structures you created, not only the content of the work, but these supporting structures of the work also illustrates the space of appearance. That's what Hannah Arendt talks about, where the political lines, you know, when people gather together in speech and action. To me, the action is not only these groups of women sitting on the stoops and talking, discussing, but also all these mechanisms you have, you know, placed in these projects. Yeah, that's really inspiring. So talking that, let's go back to Between the Door and the Streets again, because those stoops, you know, that's a very particular architecture context for this work. And to me, when I first saw this work, I felt that there's something really drew me in straight away. So to me, those are stoops, because that's, you know, as far as I understand a little bit, you know, the culture in New York, that's where people hang out and people chat with each other. So that enthused this project with a very particular poetics that draws on a sense of a place and the everyday. So that's what I meant when I talk about the poetics and the aesthetic sensibility in your work. So could you just take us through how your practice is evocative of specific locales or spaces, and both historically and politically?
Interestingly, it brings up another thing we haven't talked about, but we've inferred it in terms of talking about process, and that's image production. You asked where my authority was. And my authority is not in thinking up an image, in my mind, it's in embracing and manifesting an image. So the one thing I almost never do, I can't say I never do, but almost never do, is come into an environment that I'm invited into and come with a plan, a preconceived plan. I do come with questions, and often the people that invite me have territories they want to cover. But in the case of Anne Pasternak and Nato Thompson, they basically embraced this question and said, yeah, let's ask it, that I was asking coming out of London, which was, what is feminism and what's the difference between activism and feminism? And here that we were, I didn't come with an idea of a performance. I didn't come with the idea of stoops or even a street in Brooklyn. I just came with the topic. And as we began to talk with people, different images occur. Sometimes they occur through other people, sometimes they occur through me. In this case, I remember very clearly having gone through a half a year, walking down the street in Brooklyn where I was staying because we were working with the Elizabeth Sackler Center at the Brooklyn Museum. Because I was working with them, I was staying in Brooklyn, and I started looking at all these stoops, and you know, in New York, people sit on stoops, they talk about sitting on stoops. There's a thing called stoop culture. And so suddenly I sort of thought, well, that's interesting. What if we did it that way? We did a performance where people sat on stoops. And then, so there's an image that occurs, and I say it might be mine, it might be somebody else's, it doesn't matter. And then it begins to capture, we circulate it, and it captures my imagination. It has to, or I can't, not going to work for a year and spend a year of my life on it, or 2 years. So it has to capture my imagination, but clearly it's got to capture everybody else's, because why would they come to sit on a subway if they thought that was a bad image? And in fact, one of the advisors did leave the project because she thought everybody should sit in a park, demonstrating kind of having a picnic. And I just said in the end, as we talked it through, I said, I don't see the framing for that. A park is a big open space. How do you create a performative event with some distinction in the middle of a park? I mean, you probably could, and people probably do. But I found that the stoops, everybody else, really, literally in the advisory group and everything else, seemed to like it. So they began to develop their own imaginary about what it would be like, because they say stoops, women, politics, these issues. And so slowly we move forward and develop the image. So in terms of the image production, it's the one place that I feel is where I'm going to have the final word. And I'm smart enough to know that if the final word is something that really upsets everybody, they're not going to be in the performance. There has to be a consensus, an embracing of the image. There has to be this sort of collective imaginary that begins to be developed in the work.
This is why I feel, that this is a very unique characteristic about your social practice art. Because we know a lot of socially engaged practice or social practice, it's very subtle. The work is very subtle. It's a process-led, sometimes perhaps, doesn't have a kind of a spectacular presence at all. But then that's something, your crystal, sorry.
Crystal quilt.
Yeah, crystal quotes. When I was even an art student, that project really stayed with me. I just thought it was incredible image production, that particular work. But then, of course, the process, the conversations, the voices, equally very powerful, cogent. But then the image itself stays with me. And that's what attracted me first. So I think that's a very smart move as an artist, if I can say.
I have to say about that design of that quilt is Miriam Shapiro's. That is not my design. I produced the image that included the sound and the lights and the shape and the space of it on the floor. But the image itself of that design that you like was done by a master image maker.
That's amazing. So how you work with others as well. But a small detail I know about that project is in the process of the image making, there's certain movement choreographed with all the women sitting around the tables. They would move their arms in certain ways and create this pattern. And I, as an art student, when I learned about it, I just thought it was absolutely fascinating to see the depths of aesthetic consideration placed into this project.
Listen, we not only on that project, my one of the women that was working to make food for the performers that would show up got mad at me because I spent $7,000 on chairs. And I did it because we couldn't find uniform black chairs any place within, a 3-state range. We bought them in Tennessee and shipped them in. And she said, I've been begging for bagels. And you're like spending $7,000 on chair. But I can tell you, if you saw glimmers of gold and different things on those chairs, that image wouldn't have looked like that. And that again is where I assert my authority.
Okay. Yeah. So that actually takes us to my next comments or questions for you. So most of your works have this threefold approach. That's just how I see it. A social process that includes outreach, discussion, collective decision making, etc., and then a public performance, and then the presentation of a film or an installation developed from the public performance, and sometimes the process, and in an exhibition situation. So I wondered if you already had all these aesthetic decisions planned before all this process. So could you talk about all these three aspects?
I told you I don't. I don't have them planned. I literally almost never had the second part. You talk about the process. That's the engagement with the issue. And then it's always a performance. It could be like 3 weeks in May, which you could call a performance, but it took place over 3 weeks and involved all kinds of activities. So it's not necessarily when we talk about this project or we talk about Crystal Quilt, we're talking about real clear performative events. Also in Ecuador I did, but I do a lot of them that aren't like that, but there is an art manifestation. Sometimes you could leap over the performance, the public performance production, and put it into the museum, but not so often. I'd say that last part, the museum installation, is a constantly evolving set of ideas. I'm curious about that in terms of almost like another set of audiences. So I sort of see them as audiences more than I do sites. So there's the audience of the participants who are defining the content and to some degree, in fact, defining the image in the end by their participation in it. And then there's a public manifestation, and that's the place I've always been very, very interested in, making the private from the process into the public. The museum, I've always shown in museums and occasionally galleries, but it's not the significant part of my practice. And if you look at my practice, you'll see wide range of ways that artwork is represented within the art world. Everything from cloth collages that hang on a wall to giant 3-screen video installations.
Yeah.
They're just different audiences with different sets of languages. And even in my case, social practice and performance language has developed in museums dramatically since I began in the 70s. Used to be we stuck a black and white photo on the wall with thumbtacks and said that's a performance image.
Yeah, I guess the technology also, has played a huge role in this. Even with regards of this exhibition, I'm just, looking at my background, all these questions, in terms of decisions of how to set them up. And I'm also thinking about all these questions now. Maybe even in 2013, the social media wasn't as prevalent as now, but then how people communicate is quite different, and that would have an effect on the aesthetic decisions.
A lot of my newer works, I've actually posed those questions, like in Silver Action at Tate. I've posed, what's the difference in communicating with social media and communicating conversation-wise with each other? I deal with that quite directly in terms of images or metaphors.
Yeah, interesting. So if we can, I'm also thinking about, in terms of the cogency of a project, because I'm thinking about the projects. These projects happened 12 years ago, and then it's interesting as the preview of your exhibition at Cooper Gallery. I was interviewed by STV, and the first question from the journalist, the TV presenter, was that do you think these questions in this gallery are still relevant? And I said to the journalist, I said that, I wish I could have said no, but, I have to say yes. So obviously, projects, the cognitive projects shifts over time. But then thinking about all these questions and given that the female body is in danger of being erased from public policy under the Trump administration. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this project is becoming even more critically relevant now, especially in the States.
I think it's relevant more. I mean, I think everything is relevant now, and activism is probably even more relevant now. I see things changing that weren't even that bad when I was a kid. But I think that the cogency or the questions about whether these questions are still relevant, obviously. I mean, is poverty criminalized? Not just because of Trump, but in general, in the social attitudes about poverty, is this kind of lurking suspicion that either you're a victim or, you're inadequate or you've brought it on yourself. That's probably more prominent attitude in the United States than it is here in the UK, but it is an attitude that underlies our systems of support and equalization of support for people. So I think that the questions are completely relevant today. The work, is the work relevant? I mean, I don't know. Does it inspire people to do anything? Is it, that's the question about whether the work remains relevant.
Well, to me personally, I think absolutely still very much relevant. And we had an audience coming up to me as the preview asking if we would do a reenactment of this work, this particular piece of work in Scotland. And the people said, you absolutely should do it. And then I thought, okay, maybe I should discuss with Suzanne would you do reenactment? Would you see your projects as
I
scores?
do reenactments, but I don't do them on demand. In other words, if somebody says, like with Catherine and I, what Catherine Wood at Tate Modern, what developed as we worked on the project was we wanted to redo Crystal Quilt, and it changed form over time because of the context of England and what was happening at that moment, which was the rise in the remembrance of the Grenham Commons was big in the media. Simultaneously, there was a disparagement of older people for using too much social capital. Those two things were happening fairly overtly at the same time. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Those women, not just from Grenham Common, but from 1950 to the reason a lot of those social services are available in England today has to do with women's labor. Even the miners' movement was, filled with women. So I looked at those different movements from 1950 and the Ford strike, and then on up through housing, through, sexual orientation recognition and so on, and found that women were engaged in every single one of them, including feminism. So at different eras, at different moments. So I posed the question, why are we vilifying the very women who have worked to give us the benefits we're trying to protect? And so the project became different. It looked different. It had different context. Yeah. So I've done 3 weeks in May again, called it 3 weeks in January. And I do it in order to look at an issue or a set of issues. How's rape operating in LA today compared to the 70s? Yeah. 40 years on, 50 years on. In terms of, but I've also had, and this is for you and your colleagues, I've also had people redo my performances themselves, and I am fine with that. I'll even give you some thoughts and ideas. I just can't do it, but it's nothing horrible to me if you just take it on and do it, do your own version of it.
You don't claim the authorship or the brand. That's really interesting because there's a lot of discussions. I remember when I first left college, there's huge debates around the copyright, the authorship around reenactment. You know, there's a lot of discussions around that. And you know, the efficacy of reenactment. I know our mutual friend Emilia Jones had a lot to say about that. I'm just thinking about her. And also, I introduced you earlier. You know, you're currently a professor, so you're part of this educational discourse or pedagogy, the discourse of pedagogy. And to me, the social practice is actually a hybrid, composed of a pedagogy, activism, and a policy work. And I remember talking about Emilia, and she wrote this beautiful essay, almost like a survey essay, recently called Suzanne Lacy Between Capron and Chicago.
Yeah.
And she really, in that essay, I think we included that essay in the last exhibition you are involved in Cooper Gallery, the Ignorant Arts School. And she talks about your practice as a case study. And I have this actually quote here, and she talks about, you know, we need better models for examining interfaces between society and artists that might tell us more about how broad political concepts and strategies find their way into boundary breaking art practices. And then she goes on, she considers your practice as an ideal case study, both of the frameworks that of conceptual body / dematerialization and that of radical art pedagogy come together in Lacy's social practice, performance art, and in pedagogy, both as a student and a teacher. So my question for you, what are the challenges and the potential for art practice to connect pedagogy, activism, and policy work?
Well,
You know, as both an
pedag-
artist and an educator.
pedagogy is, I think, important for any artist that wants to change things or at least educate an audience. And activism is just who I am, and I am interested in making things better for people as I see it. And certainly I've been wrong about what better is. And policy work, I think is critical to long-term social change, but I don't think artists are very successful at that unless they stop becoming an artist and start becoming an organization or an institution. But I do think that for me, art is a site of mutual learning. I enter a project with questions, and that's what I'm really genuinely interested in, what people have to tell me. I'm interested in their lives. I care about, I mean, I just find people fascinating. And critical pedagogy. So learning is always there. Critical pedagogy is how do you analyze the learning that takes place, and how do you teach toward this equity? How do you teach toward equity? That's critical pedagogy. And I don't think art pedagogy is the same thing. And I don't think critical art theory is the same thing. There is a body of theory called critical pedagogy.
Yeah.
And I've worked with, know some of those people over time, and I'm real interested in how they think about public space. They don't think about images. They think about public space and the exchange that takes place between people and the outcomes of that change. So that's
It's
what I think
fantastic.
about critical pedagogy.
That's brilliant. I think maybe now it's a good moment. I think we have 20 minutes. Maybe that's a good moment for us to open the discussion to the audience. There might be some responses and the questions for us. So if you haven't done so, maybe now is a moment for anybody if you want to respond to what we just discussed or you have further questions. You're welcome to put the questions in the chat, or if you want to just turn your screen on and speakers on, talk to us.
Well, I do want to say that there's a couple of people who were in Silver Action that are in the audience, and thank you for identifying yourself, people.
So brilliant. So I've not had a chance to look at the chat.
We've got a
Well,
question from Anne Douglas here, and I don't know if you'd like to read it out or have us read it out for you and have
Yeah, I could try to
responses.
Sorry.
Yeah, great.
Hi, Suzanne. So what I put in the chat was, it's a superb exhibition. Congratulations to you and also to Sophia and the team. I was really struck this time around the choreography between participation and spectatorship. I know this is the quality of your work. I know it's something that you work with almost in every piece that I know, but it's very unusual. Normally even Hannah Arendt says if you're a spectator, you see everything. If you're on the stage, if you're acting, you only get a partial view. So I was just very struck. What kind of decisions do you make around that relationship? And how do you feel that constructs this dialogue in public space, which is so important?
First of all, everybody should know, probably knows Anne is a writer, a teacher, and my PhD thesis advisor. Thank you, Anne.
So you published it, Suzanne. It's superb. Really good piece of work.
I don't have time.
Yeah.
So do you mean like in Between the Door and the Street, do you mean the people who are speaking in the groups and the audience that comes in?
There's that element, which I think is a characteristic of also other pieces. But then you have this superb video where there's another level of being an audience. Yeah. And it seems to me in that complexity, there's a lot of decisions you're making around how to choreograph that space.
It is definitely true of a performance. I think it's less true of a museum because I don't have the skill set most curators bring to creating. I understand when an audience comes in, I think a lot about how are they going to be empowered to create their own narrative. So in the case of Between the Door and the Street, they literally, I knew they would go from here to here to here individually. There was no set scenario. There's a few, there's simply 60 stoops, 30 on each side, more or less. And you could stand in the middle and talk to your friend. You could take a picture. You could go over and listen to this group. You could go over to listen to that group. You could go over to this group, and your hearing might not be good enough even to hear them. And so I thought a lot about how do you get the voices amplified? Can you get them amplified? And it turns out technically there's a lot of problems and it costs a lot of money. Could have been done, but cost a lot of money. So I knew that there would be some fallout from people not being able to hear everything in every group. I mean, it just would have technologically imagined 360 people mic'd for a local amp. I mean, I don't even know how you'd do it. You probably could. But I did think about their ability to move back and forth, and I thought about limiting their ability to intervene. So that's why we had a person at STEP that would make sure that that guy who discovered that the trans person, because there were men in the project, and that's one of the decisions, by the way, Sophia, that happens along the way, a lot of political challenges. And one came up is, do you have trans people? Do you have men that aren't trans, just men? And so we negotiated those things as they came up. But in the case of the relationship, I also knew that there might be, in the case of domestic violence, you have to be very thoughtful about whether a man will show up and see a woman who's from a shelter and attack, or whether somebody will attack a trans person because they hate them so much. There's all kinds of things that go into, as you put it, choreographing the relationship. But in terms of the museum, I don't think I'm good at that, because people have often wanted me to change things based on being in that context, like particularly, well, I'm not going to go there. They've wanted me to change things, and I often don't, or I often say it's up to you, or I mean, I do suggest, but every curator worth their salt is going to be better than me at this point at suggesting discourse, communication. I do know you have to train staff around certain issues of violence. I do know you have to have consciousness raising groups for different things, but so do most curators. And I don't know, Sophia, if you would have a thought about that as well, because you do think about these issues quite seriously. What Anne's calling the choreography of participation versus spectatorship.
Yeah, it's I think, all these behind the scene works are carefully, not just choreographed, but also, thought through. And we do this kind of discussions all the time in the office. I think, my colleagues today, they all know that. And then, we could go into really in-depth and sometimes heated conversations. But I think it's absolutely necessary, and especially with the current political landscape and social conditions. And also, I think it's interesting in relation to how we define what Cooper Gallery is, and how we define the role of exhibition making in the society. We're talking, because this is social practice, and then inevitably we have to talk about this. Very early on, I talked about the influence of Hannah Arendt, the human condition, onto me as a person, but also inevitably I bring this body of ideas to the team, and we talk about it, and we have a great kind of shared ambition or aspiration. I hope my colleagues Peter and Runa would agree with me, and we consider a gallery space, almost thinking about the space of appearance as a rehearsal space for future politics. So it's not just simply about aesthetics or poetics, but also actually, in a way, if we talk about ancient Greek sense, poetics actually basically means making things happen. And then we don't kind of overly exaggerate the function of art. Sometimes I'm thinking about why I reference Suzanne's work as a conceptual art. Even sometimes I would consider in relation to abstract art, because abstract art is highly political to me. This idea of resistance and refusal, and the refusal to be what the conventionally seen as art. So we don't overly exaggerate the function of art, or whatever we could do. We can change the society, but we can certainly influence change. And I see this white cube space as a rehearsal space for future politics, and I think that's what contemporary art could do. Like what Suzanne is doing, instigate discussions and drawing attention to the issues. And that's where voices come through. I hope I'm rambling along, but I hope that's something, I'm responding to that comment. And we passionately believe in it. Is that right, Peter and Luna? I am very passionately believing in it.
For sure.
What we could do. Thank you.
For sure.
And talking about all this, actually, I have a follow-up, just a small question, Suzanne, for you. Do you consider yourself as an activist?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To me, I think your work is not just arts work. It is absolutely community organizing,
Well,
as you say.
Like I said, I have that background, and I also have always been engaged with social issues, political issues, since I was a kid. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And also,
they're exclusive. Artists can be activists or they can be non-activists, and they can still be an artist.
Yeah, for sure. I just wonder if anybody else in the audience would like to comment or any questions or even just responses.
I
was
think
wondering, Kate or Althea, did you want to say anything about Silver Action or being participants in Silver Action?
Also, I think Tim Rollins is in the audience, and so is Chris Fremantle. I mean, I think these are people that have been doing this work forever. So, and there's probably a whole bunch of you that have been doing this work forever. Might be interesting to have you identify yourselves. Sorry, Peter.
That's okay. That's okay. I was just that's a great idea. I was just saying, if anyone who was in Silver Action wanted to talk about that, but we've also had a question from Robin. Robin, would you want to speak this, and Althea after? Or would you prefer us to read this?
Hi. It was kind of a statement as well, but hello. Yeah, so it's just I'm just dead grateful to hear like your different models and stuff. And Sophia had mentioned about like invisible labour, and we've had lots of discussions at the university about that recently. And like I've been running like a grassroots volunteer space for over a year now. And my own grandma, back in the day, she wanted to go to art college, and she didn't feel like she could. So she just went and worked in a clothes shop, and that's what she did for a long time. And I think like having these models from like the 70s and 80s and that you're talking about is like so important, because these things kind of come back around, don't they? And it's good to have these. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, sorry.
Thank you, Robin. That's a really lovely comment, but it's quite. I think you actually in the chat. I'm just looking at the chat. You actually elaborated more. Of running this space. Okay, it's really brilliant to read.
I think Althea does have a comment if you want to make it, Althea.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got a weird setup here, so I'm not sure if you can actually hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, Sophia. Sorry, I feel like I'm gate crashing here. But the Silver Action, what you were just saying about the choreography. Well, the description of how you had to protect the people who were not performing, but who were part of the event out on the stoops, and being in the Silver Action was so complicated and yet so kind of seamless, weirdly. I don't know if the other participant who was also there feels the same way, but there was something about the choreography keeping the audience on the edge of the space, because we were all sitting at card tables with this incredible light down, having conversations that you would never have, necessarily with other women, and it was which was very empowering and worked very well. But my table was out on the outer edge of this arrangement, and there were people, in the audience who wanted to come and sit down with us. And it kind of depended on the table how much we interacted with others in the audience and stuff. And I thought, I felt that was important to preserve that barrier, even though, on the other hand, this is not, the work wasn't really about audience versus participants. But in order for us to feel that we could, have the conversation and explore our different versions of what feminist activism meant, and there were incredibly powerful personal stories being shared. I can see this isn't an easy thing, this relationship between the volunteer, who's also a kind of an audience. I mean, I never considered myself anything different. I was an audience at the conversation because I was listening as much as I was speaking. So, anyway, but it was a fantastic kind of experience and very complicated. And I can't imagine anybody else except for Suzanne Lacy pulling something like that off. So, I mean, I'm just pitching that in there, and just want to thank you, Suzanne. It was extraordinary.
I have to say, Althea, I didn't realize that. I was wandering around and I didn't see any of that interaction. I'm surprised, because certainly in the Crystal Quilt in Minneapolis, it was the quilt itself probably is what kept people off. The quilt. Nobody interacted with the women until it was time for them to interact with the women. So I'm sorry in terms of that intrusion. And I wish I had seen it, because I definitely would have done something about it.
Oh, well, I didn't, in a sense, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a natural thing. That's all.
It was, but protecting your ability to talk. I mean, there was a kind of a problem with that performance, which is nobody could hear what you were saying. And it was also a kind of a trope that this was not a conversation other people could participate. So it was problematic for the audience, because they could see this tableau, but they couldn't hear. The only place they could really hear was either around women who went up and had their stories entered on screens, and then everybody had access. And we had a series, you probably know, or maybe you don't, but we had a series every time there was a new tableau, which there were 5 tableaus over, one each hour. And there was another set of women at a table who were kind of prominent activists from different generations, and they were mic'd and they were surrounded. You could hear.
Yeah. I remember that because Susie Orbach was there. There were all the great and the good were at the high table. No, it was fabulous. It was wonderful. Yeah.
We also got Kate here, was part of that, who's just unmuted and joining.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? It's just really weird talking to a dark screen. Oh, hi, Suzanne. Yeah, it seems a long time ago, even though time goes fast as you get older. But my experiences are very much like Alethea's, because I remember being at that table, the yellow tablecloth of true thinking, as I referred to it later. And we had certain questions that we addressed, and we were with people that we didn't know, and it was very, very intimate. And you were aware of the people wandering around in the space, and that they couldn't come right up to the table. And if they had come up to the table, it would have felt incredibly intrusive. I mean, we had the day before when some of the questions, and we'd related our experiences in terms of a time, like a timeline that went right the way across the room. And so there were certain allegiances there and a lot of commonalities. And I was so fired up with it. I was doing my MA at the time, Sophia will know this, at Dundee. And I was so fired up with it all that I went back and I tried to draw on some of my energy and enthusiasm for what I'd experienced and set up I did it at Generator, I think, and asked some young women to come and ask them the same questions that we had addressed. And it was very difficult for them. I can't actually remember. I did try and film it, but that all went haywire. So I haven't got a record of it. But it was a very important time for me to go on that. And it was very affirming, being, an older student at 62, going back to do an MA, who dropped out of art college in the 60s, and single parent and political activist, etc., as many of those women there were. And you felt like you were in a dynamic space with those women. And then kind of going back to quite an undynamic space, if you like. So, yeah, thanks. I still remember it. It's very vivid in my mind.
Thank you. I was just asked to reproduce it in Turkey.
Are you?
Wow.
Oh, great.
Well, maybe.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Great.
Wow.
Peter, is there more questions?
We have.
Maybe we can go on.
Sorry, yeah. I think we've got time for one more. We've got a question from Lewis. Lewis, do you want to voice this out, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, sure, I can speak. If you're able to hear me, all right. Yeah, I was really kind of struck by when you say you have a strategy for everything, and I find that really interesting. And part of me thinks that I want to have a strategy for everything as well. I'm interested specifically, I guess, in terms of performance and its documentation, and how, if at all, you have a strategy for documenting, be it any performance, from the smaller scale ones to ones that are maybe larger, or if you control that at all.
The documenting, if I control the documentaries?
The documentation, I guess, the sort of ephemera that comes after.
Sometimes it's not even ephemera. Sometimes it's a central metaphor. The community makes a film, and then the film is made with community input, and then the film shows up in a museum. That happened recently in the Circle and the Square, a community in Briarfield, Northwest England, and people in that town were very involved with the whole project, including the installation at a museum and the use of the film and using it in their various grants and so on. So it really depends, but yes, I think a lot about documenting. And at this point, I try to document everything in one way or the other. But of course, documentation that ends up as a 3-screen installation, like what Sophia's showing, that is not something that is easy financially to produce.
Totally.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think maybe we should wrap up because it's already over 8 o'clock. And can we give a round of applause to Suzanne?
You, Sophia. I have to say that you, Rona, Peter, everybody that works on your staff has produced a show I'm so proud of. It is really beautiful, and I don't say that lightly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for your brilliant analysis, questions, prompts, thinking. I always get so much out of talking with you. I really do. And thank you to Amelia Jones for introducing us to each other.
I know, absolutely. But also I would like to thank all the audience joined us today and put all your thoughts and the responses and the questions. But then, last but not least, Suzanne, going back to you. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for your generosity and honesty. But before we go, if I can invite people back, next Thursday we will have an in-person event, panel discussion, asking a very serious question: what does art, or who does art make visible? That's a paraphrasing from Suzanne, your PhD. I did some research into it. All right, okay. So thanks again, everybody, and hopefully you enjoyed the event, and have a good evening, and see you back in Cooper Gallery soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Joe.